Everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. We are doing one of my favorite documentary series, Ascent of Man by Jacob Bronowski. And we are on episode 2, Harvest of the Seasons. I'm going to make this meetup extremely interactive. There are three themes, just three themes in this entire episode. One is, what is the life of a nomad like? Second, what does agriculture do? And third is, what are the primitive sources of war? So it is nomads, agriculture, and war. The theme of agriculture is a huge theme. I cannot, there isn't anything in human history as consequential as agriculture. In cultural history, there is evolutionary history, of course, but in cultural history, agriculture is a giant step forward, and it's something which is very difficult to grasp. So I'm really looking forward to see what we can do with it. So what I want to do is I want to start by letting everybody talk, try to be concise, try to, restrict yourself to maybe about 3 minutes and talk about what you got from this episode. So go ahead, type, we've got 4 rules as always. Type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. People who have not spoken much will get precedence, or people who have spoken a lot, okay? So that way we get as many voices on the table as possible. Don't try to go into pet peeves. Try to keep, this is a huge, massive topic of saying, okay, what did settlement do for human beings? That's what this entire episode is about. So we will go ahead and I'll have different people talk about it. So I'm going to start with Linda, Joe, and Dave. Linda.
Okay, you asked what we thought about the life of a nomad. Their life, as was described in the video, one day blends into the next, is like the last, is like the next, except for major challenges such as crossing the river. And as a woman, I just look at it as there is no life. You're a baby bearing machine. You're subservient to males. It's difficult to even watch it. And the part that was totally tragic was when the old were not able to cross the river, they were left on the other side to die. I think even there are nomads today, your Bedouins in Israel, live a nomadic life, and the Israelis are trying to help them settle some. But even their lives, I don't think they would leave the old to die.
Great observation. Thank you, Linda. So I think I like Linda's ideas. Let's first do nomads, then we'll go to agriculture, then we'll go to war. Okay, so it's going to be Joe, Dave, and David. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I really thought that this was an excellent episode too, because it kind of showed you what the life of a nomad was really like. And so the one aspect of it that I really looked at is and I know you want to go through nomads first and then come back to.
No, you can go ahead. You just have
okay.
Go ahead.
Because I think it's really, the nomadic life is where they start in this, and essentially they show you how difficult it is. And one of the things that I noticed that was so challenging with the nomadic life is that you're always busy. And it's necessarily, you don't have the time to even develop skills or specialization. And they go into detail about that, and that's critical. So there's no room for innovation. There's no room for even any type of growth. And you're limited to whatever your father was doing prior as well. I have new respect for dogs as well, because the dog seemed like it was taking it more challenging than when the elderly were dying than the people actually did themselves. But obviously, the single most important thing was the ability to be able to settle down and actually start to, cultivate the land. Once that occurred, then a lot of other innovations were able to be developed within that kind of in the, you know, under those conditions. And you started to see everything else to come into, even how you used water, how engineering started to appear, and people were able to essentially to have an abundance to eat. And when people had an abundance to eat, that invited the idea of war. So because there are other people who were traveling who did not have enough to eat. So I thought that this was a really, really important episode in the sense of not only how we evolved as, you know, as people, but also just some of the basic constructs of how modern society actually works. You know, the concepts of having enough time to build your skills and to innovate, to build things like the wheel, you know, and to the other part, I thought was very, very important was the domestication of animals as well. That process in and of itself was a huge step for mankind. And, you know, so I think that there's some other things that I could talk about as well, but I won't go into, you know, the idea of the Bible being a documentation of a historical document of what is actually was taking place to give us insights into that. But I'll just leave it there for now.
Wonderful. And we'll have plenty of opportunity of circling back and talking about some of these things again.
Yeah, I want to come back to the war aspect of it too, because that's really where it kind of got interesting, and especially the idea of games within that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. As I said, I had great memories or an impression of this series. But what really surprised me, because as I have told you before, I don't remember a single scene, but that so much was covered in the second episode. You know, this is the grand civilization from, you know, birth to our present day. And as Joe, my buddy, was saying, just men learning to live with the animals and using them, because ancient man was a hunter-gatherer. They would go hunt the animals and kill them and eat them. But then learning to live with the animals and domesticating some was a huge step. And then as agriculture, as you're saying, was the other huge step. It's amazing that this so much is covered. And then the last part, as Joe was saying, then the surplus due to agriculture, then we end up with the raiders coming to take the surplus. And the observation by Bronowski that an army has to be supported by other men. The army is not a productive enterprise. So even today, you know, we have an army or whatever, but they don't do that on their own. We support them for our taxes or whatever. But yeah, I'm really glad we're getting this. This is such an exciting series. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Next up is going to be David, Phil, Kevin, Laura, Kate, and Linda. David.
Yes, agriculture can be divided into two, which is the herding on one hand and the farming on the other. And of course, you know, every expert's got their own opinion on how it all evolved. But of course, right across the steppe lands in Central Asia, which of course start in, well, at the western end, around about, you know, Austria, and at the eastern end, Mongolia, and you have this huge area, and these were the cattle herders. You know, we're looking what, 2000 BC. It's those cattle herders who invaded India, by the way, and also spread west. But anyway, yeah. So just trying to think of the point I'm trying to make. So they were nomads, cattle herding nomads. And what the scholars have done, they've given us a stage that's usually ignored, and it's prior to farming. And that is, and in their junky way, their terminology, instead of the hunter-gatherers, it then became the hunter-gardeners, because they reaped, they harvested the wild, the wild crops. So that's, and they reserved the term of farming, that's in other words, agriculture proper, for actually sowing. So there's that point where they're reaping and harvesting the wild crops and making bread, etc., out of it. But farming proper only commences when they actually sow. See, they domesticate the crops. They actually sow them, and that required irrigation often. So the nomads with their herds would wander around also to the different areas, I mean, because of the food for the herds, but they also wandered around because, I mean, they'd harvest one area and then they'd go to another set of wild crops.
Thank you.
And that's why they claim, on a final point, that's why they claim that the actual beginnings, of whatever you want to call them, the civilizations, took place in those flood valleys. Because in the flood valleys, you had the harvesting of the wild crops. That's enough from me.
Wonderful, thank you. That's a great point. The point, and this happens both for plants and animals. So in the previous episode, we saw these people, laps, who were just following the herd. You know, herd is there, and it's an intermediate step between just being a hunter-gatherer and being a settled agriculturalist, where in the first case of animals, you just follow the herd wherever it goes and live that way. In case of plants, you don't plant the plants, you simply harvest them wherever they are, and you move into place with that. So you're using plants and animals in a more purposeful way and more intensive way than hunter-gathering, but not as intense as the settlement, where you have to actually transform the agriculture, the water flow, in order to maintain both animals and plants. Thank you. Next up is Phil, followed by Kevin. Phil.
Yeah, I see something a little different from a different point of view. I think this was about the development of civilization. I think the herders were a half step, as you say. They were already on their way of domesticating animals. But to start to farm means they have to settle down in a settlement, which means they were developing villages and then towns and then cities, which means they are dividing. They were inventing a whole nother world that's separate from nature. So there was a splitting off from nature in one sense, and what you exploit nature to domestication and farming to create the world. And by settling down, you also develop the notion of property. I mean, land and ownership and all that kind of stuff. So that was just another thing that, in a sense, the exploitation of nature begins to intensify the separation from nature in order to create this separate world of human beings, of separate understanding and inventions that arise from that. But I have some criticism of that, is that they were not careful enough to also not necessarily separate from nature, but also continue to remember nature. That's my big criticism of it. But nonetheless, civilization was about creating this division, a very distinct division between what nature is and was, and what the world of civilization is.
Wonderful. Excellent point. Excellent point. Bronowski, I mean, he's so brilliant. He makes this point very forcefully in the next episode. And he's using he's using the hand in order to make the point. What the hunter-gatherer does is that he uses the hand in a more kind of a molding motion. He moves, manipulate things, but he kind of just readjusts them a little bit. Whereas in the agricultural things, you're actually cutting, you're actually hitting and dividing things.
That's right.
So it depends on your understanding of the nature, the structure of nature. So you have to know how the wood is structured, how you can strike it so that you can make a wedge. How can you strike a stone so you can make a tool of a certain kind? How can you strike the ground so you can convert that into an irrigation ditch? And then by understanding the structure of nature, you're transforming the nature to make possible a more complex, orders of magnitude, more complex being. And the big point that Bronowski makes is that everything else that follows from agriculture is building on the same idea. Whether it is the plow or the nuclear reactor, it is along the same lines. It's just more of that. So this division between settlement and non-settlement is huge. And I also think that the nomads that he picked is not a perfect example of it, because they are kind of little, as you're saying, that they have already taken the step. They have domesticated animals. That's also a huge step. If you want to really look at a previous stage, you have to look at a pure hunter-gatherer, where it's just hunting and just gathering without carrying the herd with you. But of course, the point of settlement is fantastic, is huge. Next up is going to be Kevin, Laura, Kate, Linda, and Joe. Kevin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'll make 2 points. One is for nomadic tribe lifestyle, I would say why we keep innovation, every individual, a community keep innovation, let them live their own style. Indigenous people, that's something heritage, or we can learn from it little by little later on. It's like ancient, antique. Live there, let them live their own style, as long not bother, other community or country. That's one. Second one, I want to make a point. Just now we seen the link is about 170 years ago. It's about in Asia, Mongolia basically conquer around China, South, North, like Russia, and South Asia. And it's everywhere. For example, based on this wiki page, the population in North China decreased from 50 million in the 1155 to 8.5 million in Mongolia time. Basically, this is 6 times population dropped. And we talk about civilization. That time is before this, they called Yue dynasty is the Sung. We Tao Sung, like that's the advance. They like the English name called Colombo. They discovered North America. They assume the boat very big and very advanced. They travel around the world too. However, this just cannot build the lose the war with Mongolia. So that's obviously multiple folder looking at this something. Thank you.
Thank you. But one of the big points that Bronowski makes, that even when the Mongols conquered the world, and they conquered a large part of the world absorbed them. The agricultural world kind of absorbed them. And that happened in India. Like that's also the story of India. Like David was pointing out, India was invaded by the Aryans, who were cattle herders. But then they just entered this ocean of people, of settlement, and they became settled themselves because there are tremendous advantages of settlement. And that's where all the value is being created. Thank you. Next up is going to be Laura, followed by Kate. Laura.
Okay, I just want to make a point that when the nomads stopped moving, it was the first time families were able to form relationships with other people, which obviously brings the beginning of community, which I think was also important during the agricultural period.
Thank you. Laura, I mean, frankly, I don't think that is true. Like if you look at the nomad families, they are actually very close because they are moving around in a group of people. The hunter-gatherer families are actually very, very close. It's a small number of people, but that group is very closely knit on a scale which is much, much deeper and than a settlement. In settlement, what happens? There are lots of loose connections, lots of weak connections. But in a hunter-gatherer,
okay,
it's.
I got the sense since they were always on the move, they didn't really have the ability to develop relationships, and that's what I understood.
Thank you. I mean, it is absolutely true that a modern person on the move would not be able to develop relationships, but the way they are on the move is that they're actually moving with all the people. So the people are always around you. It's the environment which changes and people remain the same. And that's very much our tradition, our primate tradition of, not tradition, but that's our evolutionary heritage, that kind of unit of family. Next up is going to be, folks, I'm going to give priority to people who have not spoken before. So it's going to be Kate, Linda, Joe, and David. Kate.
Yeah, I think that Laura might have a point in terms of like exchange of ideas, at least like when people came together, maybe, if someone had a new idea for a new technology, it could spread more easily. But what I originally was going to say is that I'm aware that archaeologists now say that, if a culture hasn't changed in, 10,000 years, that means it's successful. It's working for them and they don't need to change it. And I think what really causes a civilization, or what causes a culture to change, is challenges like environmental change, environmental challenges. To some extent can really propel that. And if you don't have those challenges, you might not have the incentive to change. And I know there are theories that humanity might have evolved in the first place, and specifically in the Rift Valley, because there was a lot of geologic change, causing a lot of environmental change very rapidly over the period of time that we were evolving. So yeah, I mean, I think human ingenuity is, obviously, the main driver, but I think maybe there's another piece that comes into that, which is the environmental change and challenges.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Linda.
I was very impressed by the video and thinking of Bedouins in terms of the loyalty to family must be so strong that it holds these groups together despite interaction with others that they were talking about, that they trade with other groups for things that they have not invented. But what also comes to mind is they're apparently inbreeding a great deal. And if you have this level of inbreeding, could it be that generations, you have a fair number of individuals who don't have the intellectual capacity to grasp anything more than this? Inbreeding is a very bad thing to do, even with animals. And a limited family group like this, they're apparently inbreeding. But with the Bedouins, I'm curious about, Bedouins have survived up until now. You still have Bedouins in the Negev. what keeps these people as Bedouins, aside from the devotion, the loyalty to family? The penalty for leaving family must be to be considered dead. So there is not a chance to leave, even if an individual sees something better. The penalty for going to that better place is too high.
Excellent. I mean, it's a very, very interesting points, because what happens is that there are two ways of looking at it. You can look at these people in their natural surroundings, in their natural context in which they develop this particular culture. And now what you're saying is that let's look at this in the larger culture, the agricultural culture, which actually surrounds them. And they are kind of, so what are the incentives for remaining with the tribe, with that? And what are the things about, what are the advantages of just leaving or adapting some of the things, maybe halfway? So it's really, really interesting. I mean, we looked at the same issues yesterday with Aborigines, and to what extent the oral culture remains an oral culture when there are people in the community who start reading and writing, and what is the impact of that? So it's a fantastic question.
I have a question. Can I ask a question in regard to that, Shrikant?
Go ahead.
I wasn't at the discussion of the Aborigines, but my guess would be there's not a penalty for them learning. They are not ostracized if they do become educated. Would I be correct in thinking that?
I do not know. I do not know the people, I do not know much about Aborigines. I have to tell you, the most delightful thing was that there was somebody from Australia who showed up, who has interacted extensively with Aborigines. So we basically said, hey, Ash, now it's yours. You tell me how it works, because there is really no substitute for actual interaction with these people to grasp the difference, the chasm between, and that chasm is very important. Again, making this point, you have to, in order to fully appreciate the transition from the hunter-gatherer stage to a settled stage, you kind of have to put yourself in the mind of that person, like you were doing, of saying, what would it be like being a woman or being an old person there? What would it actually be like? Because it's very different. It's tempting to actually put our own thoughts, our own ideas, our own presuppositions in their context, but that's not the case. So that's, I mean, and we are going, anthropology is going through actually a golden age right now. There is, over the last 20 years, what we have found out about these cultures is so much, it's like order of magnitude more than what Bronowski had access to. So it's a great starting point, but there is a lot that can be added. Next up is going to be Joe, David, and Phil. Joe.
Yeah, no, one other thing that I thought that was, and I'm going to come back to what essentially Phil was talking about, just how important it is to, once you have that community, and essentially you go from a nomad culture to a village culture, is the thing that struck at me is that how they were talking about even the idea of water rights and rules that had to be implemented once they started to settle on the land itself. Because that really starts to say, now at a certain point where you're on the move all the time, if it's about survival, you don't necessarily have the rules of that you need the order. The order is given to you by nature. Whereas when you're settled, then you need to actually start to come up with a set of rules and regulations that allow you to function as a society. And then the society itself then grows as well. And it's amazing because we're still talking about water rights today is a very big issue. But how much water you could use, how much you could tell, and the engineering that came along with it. I thought that was a very, very important part. because it's showing you the forethought that is, you know, coming up with how do you manage it's not just a hunter-gatherer society, but a society that is growing. And once it hits a certain scale, that you have to have these social contracts, so to speak, in place in order to function properly. So this really is, as Phil was saying, the birth of civilization as we know it. And then we can get into the aspect of it, of how horses led to wars in a little bit.
The point you're making is a huge point. The point is that moment you move to agriculture, and I'm still trying to grasp the kind of the profundity of it. Moment you move to agriculture, you have to have rules, because agriculture, you see, in some ways, Bronowski did not pick a good example. What is the name of those tribes? It's not the right tribe to look at. You have to look at hunter-gatherer, because
the Quanats, what are they, or something?
But basically the point is that agriculture, in order to eat, you have to take action over a long period of time. You have to sow, you have to, water, the crop has to grow, then you have to bring in the crop, then you have to protect the crop, and you have to distribute the crop. And everything else kind of rests on this long range systematic process. If it fails anywhere here, the entire city is destroyed. So it is not something that, okay, I'm just going to try and hunt something. If it's not, I'll be a little bit hungry, then I'll try to make do with gathering what is there. This is a long range enterprise, and it is a cooperative enterprise that involves many, many more people whom you do not see. See, it is very easy to coordinate with your family when you're all trying to gather together, or when you're trying to hunt together, because we are all in sight, in hearing distance, and we can coordinate that way. But agriculture happens over long distance and long time. And for that, you need the rules. And it's not arbitrary rules. Those have to be specific rules that actually make it work. So it is the idea of saying, how do you actually cut? What is the structure of nature? How is the river, and what are the ebbs and flows of the river? So how do I need to dig the ditches so that whatever happens with the river over the year, my fields will be largely fine? Okay, that calculation, that is the calculation that makes cities possible. Go ahead, John.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an incredible point. Like, how much water am I going to be using? How much are you allotting to each group? I mean, and so the idea of math, almost, you start to have to really start to figure out all these other things that start to, and this is where the birth of kind of civilization. And I had another really important point related to this specific thing, but everything is the trust factor of someone that you don't know.
Yes,
is crucial. I mean, that's crucial to today's markets as well. You go out to a store, you're handing them something, that's just money. But if you're making a transaction with somebody that you don't know, that is a huge step for civilization, because it takes you from a family of how many, I don't know, depending on how big your family was, to the rest of the world. And then that's the birth of a market per se.
Exactly. That's huge point, because what happens is that in a tribe, like we saw, there justice is done kind of in an interactive way. Everybody is right there. Anybody who is not really being fair to other people can be called out by are called out by multiple people, and that acts as a continuous check, emotional check, to kind of keep people in the right direction. That's not the case when you go to a city. lots of people you are not seeing most of the people. They are not there. The interaction happens over time. You're giving somebody something, they are going to give you something back at a later time, at a different place. And that requires explicit kind of agreements, explicit kind of saying, okay, these are our agreements. I'm giving you this. I mean, in Sumeria, for example, it is, I'm giving you this baked clay tablet, which is a receipt of what grain you brought in. And then I'm going to honor that when you come to collect the metal that is going to come from on a ship. So that, yeah, go ahead.
Or yeah, you're right. It's accounting. And then also the thing that's interesting is how this leads to games overall. Like, because games, you're going to play the game, right? As long as you're trusting the other individual, as long as that, but then you'll take yourself out of that in that game. And essentially you have choices as well. And this gets back to, we talked extensively here at 52 Living Ideas about the theories of games and their importance within that, like, you know, how they interact with our social, how they impact our social interactions.
The key part of this about games is the rules of the game.
Yes, yes.
The games have to be such that most people want to play the game. That is the crucial thing. You know, how do you design those rules so that it is win-win for most people? In order to, okay, so we're going to go with Amanda next. Amanda, go ahead. Folks, if you have not spoken.
Hi, Shrikant. Hi, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to turn.
I just want to say that anybody who has not spoken before or spoken much gets a chance to speak first. So go ahead, Amanda. Welcome.
So first of all, I just want to thank you for doing this, Shrikant. You're an excellent host, and I really enjoy this. I'm here again with my brother. I didn't put his name on my
right?
title. So, oh my God, you remember? Thank you.
I'll change the name.
So we were listening to everyone's comments, and I just want to go back to Linda. We were talking, Linda, you had mentioned, like, this is, you had mentioned inbreeding, and I know this isn't a popular topic, but when we're talking about social contracts, right, and rules, like, the first thing that comes to mind is this is where the origins of shame came from, and I'm not, I'm not shaming shame, right? Like, I know shame is looked on as not a great thing nowadays, but it served a really important purpose in those times because it's one of the greatest forms of social control, and I think that's, when they didn't have laws and they didn't necessarily have like regulations and enforcers and whatnot, shame was really just a powerful way to sort of keep things in alignment with how they wanted them to go. And so I thought that would just be an interesting topic of conversation for some other time. That's a whole other thing, but I had to kind of add that when we're talking about social contracts. I feel like it was probably very important in those early days because shame sort of equaled death, right? If you were shamed, if you were outcasted from your in-group, right, you could die. And so it's interesting because now, when you're talking about sociology and psychology, and you look at shame, the feeling can often mirror death. Like, it goes to our primal origins of what, shame really meant for someone, in survival with a group. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to add that. So thank you for your comments, everyone. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Next up is going to be Phil. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, you also have to take account of the time this was in, like 10,000 BC, maybe to 5,000 BC. So there was still this transition that's happening. So I'm thinking that the nomads, they wander around, but there was still plenty of space where people could wander around. And remember, there's still the instinct about the old tribes. They were relatively small, and people were very loyal to the tribes, right? But I think they did know that too much inbreeding was wrong. And so what happened is that these tribes would trade populations. In fact, I think there's kind of a general rule. I'm not an anthropologist, but I can't state this for sure. There's a general rule that the women are exchanged for other women, so there wouldn't be this continual inbreeding, among the other nomads. And as far as the nomads are concerned, when you come to a civilization as advanced as, let's say, Babylonia, I mean, yeah, you trade with them. You bought the furs or whatever you bought, and it's like, it's such an alienating culture that you might be like, wow, this is magnificent. Let me abandon my tribe and I go live here. You're not going to be able to survive in that complex culture. So in some sense, it's a matter of survival as well. But you do learn, I think you do learn something. And this go back to the Mongols, which of course a little later. There's information being exchanged. The Mongols would not have been able to conquer China if they did not learn enough technology to invent the synthetic bow that was short bow. It was a very powerful bow that they could use when they're great horsemen that they could use while riding the horseback. And when they thunder across the plains with these bows, with these weapons, very modern, in fact, more modern than the modern civilizations, they were a terror. In addition to this sort of animal instinct that they were able to conquer that, but they wouldn't have been able to do it just by hooping and howling without this synthetic bow that they had learned from other cultures and perfected themselves. So therefore, what happened when they conquered China? Kublai Khan was there, and when he became domesticated, because China ought to become more Chinese than the Chinese, they were thrown out because they had lost this sort of raw instinct that they had. So in some sense, you could even say that there wasn't, even at that time, at the earlier time, about this, there wasn't a degree of cosmopolitanism. There was still a kind of like, you belong to this city and you're loyal to that city and that civilization. So I don't think cosmopolitanism was a little bit later in development, which you actually accepted other people into your tribe in large numbers. So you learn from them, but you remain distinctly. Look what happened to Greece. They're all Greeks, but they were separate city-states.
Thank you. I mean, absolutely. This is fantastic points, Phil. I mean, you can look at even the mores of each of the people. Like, for example, they're saying here, Bronowski makes the point that they marry their distant cousins in order to keep the cohesion. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, if you use that strategy, it is kind of self-limiting strategy, as opposed to saying, having the more that you do not marry your cousin. So that what that does is that means something about kind of this expansion, connection with other people, expanding of connections with other people. It's not only at a biological level, but at a cultural level. It's huge. And the entire progress of civilization, after civilization comes, is the progress of being able to deal more with people who are not just like you. In a tribe, you're dealing with people whom you have grown up with, with just your family. That's it. Everybody else it's a stranger, it's a danger, keep away. That's the modus operandi. In a city, there is a whole bunch of things that come about, including things like religion, to say that, okay, each person is equal in the eye of God, even if they are not from my family. So I may not treat them as my family, but I have to treat them at some level. So some basic level gets formed. That also is kind of saying, okay, my city versus rest of the cities versus other cities. And then slowly it kind of keeps growing from that. There is a role that people like, traders play in that, explorers play in the expansion of that. So there is a progression of civilization, and we're going to go through all these stages. All right, next up, we're going to go with Mike. You have something to say. 2 minutes, please. Go ahead.
30 seconds. Up until last Tuesday, for most people in this world, the statement that from Hobbes' Leviathan, his life was solitary, nasty, brutish, and short applied. And the young lady who said that people didn't change anthropologically or whatever unless they had a reason to change, they always had a reason to change. Between war, violence, Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, earthquake, weather, and flood, there was always a reason to change, and they were always in trouble. Now we've obviously solved all those problems, so we don't have a reason to change. But thank you very much.
All right. I don't know about the last comment, but I agree with you that we all have. It's a very different view. I mean, one view is to say that everything in human beings happens because of crisis, and we're trying to just solve crisis. I think, their crises do produce new things. I don't think that's the only thing that goes on, because there is a lot more to civilization. There is a lot more that is produced as a result of good things. Like, you have prosperity, so you have time to do other things. You can develop tools, you can produce art. So there is civilization, growth of civilization that comes from the accumulation of the results of civilization. And that is very profound. That's a very large part of the progress of civilization. Now, I'm trying not to lose track of anybody here who has typed exclamation mark. So it's going to be David Miller, Dave, and Joe. David.
Well, to get back to the issue of trust that Joe and Shrikken were discussing, how important the deal was, the agreement between people, the fulfillment of the contract, so to speak, or the covenant in more religious terms, of how vital that was. Because if someone reneged on an agreement, if you gave half your catch to someone else, and when they had the catch of meat, if they didn't reciprocate, you were hungry at least and dead. Anyway, so that loyalty to that agreement and that deal became so paramount for those ancients that the scholars claim that is why amongst those Indo-Iranian cattle herders of the steppe lands, that the god Mithra, the god of loyalty, became more or less one of the chief gods. And that was taken by them into India, 1600s BC, and westwards. And it hit the Mediterranean. And the Hittites wrote about them. It was a grouping called the Mitanni, who they were the charioteers. They had that advanced spoked wheel, Bronze Age weapons, and they actually pushed the ancient Egyptians out of the northern end of their empire. But this is sort of in the 1500s, 1400s BC, and the Hittites wrote about them. So they wrote that they had that god Mithra, the god of loyalty to the covenant, the agreement, the contract, the deal. And also the other chief god was Varuna, the god of truth, because, truth-telling was also so vitally important in those sort of ancient semi-nomadic peoples. So it's an interesting point.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Okay, Bob, you have not spoken before. Bob, go ahead. Bob, do you have anything to say? Okay, let's.
Yes, just a comment about the stirrups. That was highly used by the Mongols, and that may have given them a tremendous advantage, whereas the Romans didn't use them. The other thing is about the inbreeding. It depends on the size of the group, and because if you have a small group, the gene pool is going to you inbreed. You're going to have duplicates, and that gives rise to bad things. But if you have a large group, it's okay. It's perfectly all right to inbreed if you have 100,000 people.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Dave, followed by Joe. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. Would you like 2 or 3 minutes on wheat?
On wheat, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. I come from Kansas, and we humbly call ourselves the wheat state. And I think in northern India, you grow some wheat there as well as rice.
Dave, I have passed through Kansas, and I've been driving, and I can see nothing but wheat for a long time. Yes.
When you say goodbye, this is the waving wheat.
Okay.
When it turns golden and it gets, anyway, it's ripe, it waves back and forth in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, ancient man would grab, the seed, or the grass has a stalk with seeds on it, and we call that the head. But they would probably grab that and would have more nutrition than the blade of grass. And we have what we call natural selection. Each year they would grab the biggest heads and seed them. And so each crop would get bigger and bigger and bigger. But the breakthrough, as Bronowski said, was wheat bread. That there was some DNA change. I forget when the genes changed, whatever. But anyway, it looked like the head about doubled. And they wanted to say, hey, we've got something here. And when Bronowski was in the field, he was taking the head between his hands. It reminded me, my grandfather, I went out with him in his field, and he would do that. He would take the grains and put them in his mouth and chew them. And I think it would make kind of a paste, and that's how he knew it was ripe and time for harvest. And so the ancients, they'd grab that and they'd start chewing it, and they say, hey, this is great stuff. But as we said, there would be excess, so they'd set that aside. Well, in a week or two, it turns hard. And you might chew on that, and that's not going to do any good. And so Igor, somebody came up, and I think I'll grind those between 2 stones or whatever, and then you come up with flour. And then somebody else decide, well, what can I do with that? Well, stick some water and make it kind of a paste. And if I can bake that, I come up with unleavened bread. And if some mold flies in and it becomes yeast, it forms bubbles, and then we have leavened bread. So yeah, it was a huge part of agriculture. And I love the part he called them the scythe, but I call it more like a knife blade made of stone. Of the old head, they would just have a cutting, striking motion, as you were saying. But they discovered with these big heads, if they did that, the head would shatter. We talk about separating the wheat from the chaff. The wheat would just fall to the ground and chaff, and you would have nothing. So they had to develop what looked like a saw to saw through the stalks. So a lot of innovation there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Dave, that was fantastic. Thank you. I just want to add one point that Bronowski makes to that when this head became really plump, it stopped flying away. So it ended up depending on human beings for its transmission. So it is like this kind of co-evolution. The point that Dave was making about selection that is going on, that all farmers do with their crops as well as their livestock, to kind of keep making the stock better and better. And in the process, and partly through chance mutations, you have this phenomena where you have a wheat that depends on man for transmission. Next up is going to be Joe.
Yeah, I think it was when the wheat crossed with the natural goat grass that it actually became really plump to be able to harvest much more. That's the pollination that was a crossover, and they talked about the number of chromosomes. I forget, it was like 23 to 42 that occurred. But one of the interesting things that we were just, as I was talking about before, is this idea of coordination and how we actually are able to function as a society. There are two sides to that, because, and he calls this out, he says that war and theft are not necessarily part of the human instinct. It's a coordinated effort that has to be done. So that there's two sides to this story too, is that once you have this coordination, you have these groups, and one has more than the other, then you're going to go and you would start with organized war. So it was that was when people would write in and essentially, but if you think about it, war and theft takes a tremendous amount of coordination. And that happens again because of civilized culture. You know, that kind of coordination is able to be done. You know where people are, they have a routine. In addition to, though, it also gives people that have you know, not so good intentions to be able to coordinate and come, and so that's where you start to see the introduction of conflict being come into play as well. So that, I mean, that's an important part to really kind of recognize, because that's where essentially the chapter ends, or is, you know, and he says it doesn't matter if it's a, you know, we could have a Stalin, a Hitler, or whatever. These horses coming in, you know, to steal your products were essentially like tanks rolling in back in the day, and so it's a fascinating it's a fascinating thing to see how humanity can take something that is, you know, so productive, and then all of a sudden, you know, it turns into something so destructive as well.
Wonderful. All right, folks. So what I want to do now is I want to let's see, Rupali, you're trying to understand where everybody is. Okay. All right. Let's see here. What I want to do is I want to do a short breakout room so we can discuss it, discuss these things amongst each other, and then we can come back with the best question that we have. I want to do a lightning round. That will be a way of, instead of these, what we've done is that we've given enough chance for people to lay out how they're thinking about things. Now we discuss it together. And the aim is to come up with the biggest questions that we have. Okay. And then we are going to try to answer them all together. Let's see. I'm going to appoint moderators, facilitators. You just have to, facilitators, all you have to do is to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak. So Jeff, can I call upon you for being a moderator of one of the rooms?
Sure, that would be fine.
Wonderful. Joe, how about you?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Rupali, are you able to do moderating? Are you in a place where you can do that?
I can do that.
All right. So it's going to be Rupali, Joe, and Jeff, and all they have to do is to make sure that those 4 rules are there. Everybody gets a chance to speak. Everybody is courteous. Everybody lets it, you know, be brief, and it's going to be just 20 minutes, and then we're going to come back here and come back with the biggest question we have. This is actually one of the biggest issues about human beings. What is the nature of civilization? What and how do you separate it out from what was not civilization? That distinction, it's huge, and that's what this chapter is about. So I'm starting the breakout rooms now. See you back in 20 minutes. Welcome back. Welcome back, folks. All right, so it's time for the lightning round. only the biggest questions. So we're talking about the nature of civilization itself. So let's see what we can do. So go ahead. Who'd like to ask? Just go ahead and put the questions down. I'm going to collect all the questions, organize them, and then we're going to go through all of them. Let's start with Joe. Joe, go ahead.
I'm trying to frame it in my head, but this is a co-question with Laura. So, how did the concept of a village impact the family or women in the tribes? Because there's a distinction of how they were, essentially how they were handled as nomads. And so how does the domestication of, or becoming a village impact women?
So basically, how did the role of women change from the nomad stage to the agriculture stage?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Phil. Phil, what's your question?
Yeah, my question is like, to what degree did cities, not villages or even towns, was the thing that spurred on civilization the most, because the density allow ideas to pile on top of ideas, to secondary ideas, to third level ideas. Whereas even if you have a town, you have a good idea, but it'll be 100 years later before somebody else has another idea. By that time, they forgot your idea, so you can't build it up anyway. So,
oh, thank you. Coming from New York, sitting in New York, I know what you're talking about. The next up is Kevin.
Yeah, my question is, do you think those survival skills from a nomad people still useful to, for example, for problem solving? One example, let's say they can use rope, make different ties. They can tie loose tie, tie like modern kids. We cannot tie own things.
Okay, what skills from nomads can we use today? All right, anybody else? That's too few questions. I got only 3 questions. More questions, please. Go ahead, Rupali.
So I wanted to share that David had a question about, David, would you like to ask a question, or would you like me to phrase it for you?
No, you can go ahead.
All right. So David had a question about how did the transition occur from nomadic lifestyle to civilization, where the civilized societies developed specialized tools and technologies like metallurgy and so on and so forth. So what, how did that transition occur?
How did the transition occur from the nomadic to the settled?
Yeah, where, also where the nomadic lifestyle required them to kind of go get some of their tools from outside the tribe. And so when and how did that transition happen, where how could you have so nomadic and yet also an advanced?
Got it. Thank you. Next up is going to be Judith. Judith.
So I'm wondering what factors were involved as we move from nomadic to settled that created the idea of individual and questioning that comes with being individual, I believe. What factors kind of encouraged that or limited that as a nomadic tribe?
Wonderful. Excellent question. What ideas created the kind of individual's ability to ask questions, forge his own path and thoughts? Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Jeff. Joe.
Yeah, that was my exact question. The idea of the individual in a tribe versus, yeah, so she captured it nicely.
Excellent. Next up is Jeff.
I'm curious about the role of conflict between tribes, if you will, and the preparation to fight, and then the engaging of warlike interactions, and how that fit into the progress of civilization.
And you're talking about nomadic tribes, hunter-gatherer tribes?
Well, I guess so. In a way, so there, did that somehow lead to greater consolidation, or and maybe what was the role of the warrior, in the tribe, and all those, everything related to conflict.
Okay, conflict in hunter-gatherer tribes. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, so we got quite a few questions. Let's see where to start. Cities, skills of nomads. So we got role of women. How does the transition happen? How does the concept of individual come to be? What is the role of conflicts? Okay, so how about we talk about transition first, transition from nomad to settled, and then talk about, let me see here, individual, this is higher level. So then let's talk about, continuing on that kind of role of cities as opposed to small villages. So that's like we're going in the order of saying, okay, nomads to a settlement to a city, and what happens in each of them, which is really the core of this. So we'll start with that. Okay, so folks, if you want to answer the question, how did the transition happen from nomad to nomadic life to a settled life? I mean, there is a lot of evidence. I mean, one part of it is that for settled life, you need water. You need a lot of water. And what happens is that when there is water, there is plentiful plants and animals who can survive there. So you don't need to move as much as you would do in the arid lands, for example. So that's one point. And then you start off, there is a transition of saying that, okay, instead of going around gathering, I can gather only in this area. So you're kind of there, and that when things grow, all you're doing is you're kind of harvesting in the beginning, and you're kind of following the animals that are there. It wouldn't be kind of long distance, but basically it's kind of fertile regions where you start using the agriculture which is there, the plants which are there without planting, and then slowly get the idea of planting. That's the best thing that I have heard, but I think there is a lot more information there. And but that's I see as a transition, because if you look at hunter-gatherer, one of the points that he makes is that at a hunter-gatherer stage, the amount of space that you need in order to support yourself, I think he was saying like 2 square miles per person or something like that. It's humongous. You can't really, that means you have to keep moving all the time. So there has to be a place where you don't need to move as much, and kind of these fertile deltas, that's where, river valleys, that's where, all of this started, where where there was the context of plants being there, and you're just harvesting them in the beginning, and then slowly you get the idea of that. But I think it is also connected with the animals as well. Joe.
I think actually you captured everything that I pretty much wanted to say. Yeah, I mean, you have to look at what are the resources that are surrounding a particular area. Is the soil good? Are the animals able to, be domesticated, and then are you near water? The only thing I can add to that is something that Dave said the other night during a Jordan Peterson meetup. He said, why is there a story always about floods? And this is kind of an example as to why, maybe because everybody was near water in order to live. So I think that that's an interesting aspect of it, maybe that just a little added note. But I think you really captured it. You have to be able to cultivate the land, and it has to be sustainable. And I don't have a lot to add on.
Yeah, I will add one more thing to that. This is a point that Jared Diamond makes very well. It's also, what what animals and what plants are available there. So for example, the way in which Bronowski puts it, civilization is water plus wheat. You do need the wheat. And wheat is not there everywhere. The right wheat is not there everywhere. Similarly, the kind of domesticated animals vary considerably. There weren't as good a set of domesticated animals in South America. So there, the civilization, this is Jared Diamond's point, that developed slower there. Next up is going to be Dave, followed by Phil. Dave, what do you think is the transition? How does the transition work from nomadic to agriculture?
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. Getting back to wheat, but just thinking, the surplus. I think the surplus is key to a lot of this stuff, because the farmer discovers he can grow 10 times more wheat than he can ever eat, and it can just sit there and rot. But he can hire 5 servants to build a house for him. And I think my brother Dave would ask about metallurgy. We can start specializing. I'll send the guy go up in the hills and see if there's something useful in the hills or whatever. And we can find some free range copper, or whatever, and start making metal tools. To me, this surplus, that's big stuff. And that's when I think the town starts forming, and several successful farmers, all with surpluses, then we form a town. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Phil.
Yeah, if you look at the 4 old and major civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Indus Valley, and China, they're all in reasonably large rivers. So you have the fish, you have probably other animals around to begin with. I'm surprised that China didn't develop at the Yangtze River, because it seems to me that's close to where you could grow rice. And so in some sense, it makes sense. I mean, why didn't it happen? Well, it did happen in the Levant later, but even, Anatolia, but that was later. They were mountain people that came down, invaded, Mesopotamia, and Egypt was isolated. Why didn't it happen in Africa when the Congo was a big river? Maybe it was too big. There was too much flooding. The Nile was very reliable. Very, very seldom does it flood, and it's so reliable that you could almost count on it. You still have to take measurements, but so in some sense that is the case. And once you get there, it's like then you could start developing transportation, and you could begin to grow and start irrigation, expand into the desert part. So it really is in the rivers. And if you live in a small river, you're kind of stuck. It could develop to a certain degree, and then you run out, and then you have to move somewhere else. So in Europe, it remained reasonably small towns for a very long time, And then of course, in the Central Asia, well, they kept leaving in order to invade Europe instead of invading directly into Mesopotamia.
There isn't that much water there, yeah. And you're absolutely right. It's the rivers. Next question is continuation of this transition from small settlements to a city. What does city bring? And how is it different? Now I'm very, very biased here, so I'm going to let everybody speak first about this. So what do you think is what happens with cities? Okay, I'm going to start speaking. I mean, there is a whole combination of things that come into being pretty much at the same time. You have cities, you have writing, you have monuments, you have monarchies, you have religions, you have moralities, you have accounting, you have you have irrigation, you have long distance trade, you have just kind of more openness to strangers, than was there in kind of smaller settlements, which is a characteristic of the city. So there are all these things happen at the same time. So even a city of 5,000, like in Anatolia or Jericho, I mean, that's a huge step forward. And it is truly, it's a game of numbers, and how many people can productively interact with one another. Suppose there are 1,000 people and all of them are living in isolated groups of 30, what they can produce versus when they are actually interacting with one another is just, it's orders of magnitude higher, because every good idea that is produced gets transmitted everywhere and is being used and becomes part of the culture, and you keep on building this culture together. So I love New York. Next up is going to be Joe, Dave, and Rupali. Joe, Phil, Dave, and Rupali. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, what are the advantages of cities over, like, you know, as far as you captured this in your 4 systems model, right? And then the ideas, even of family itself changes, like, because you could be dependent upon the system, not necessarily your family. So the idea of an individual really becomes something that's, you know, it becomes something that's possible. So this is where things like you're no longer dependent upon necessarily everybody else for your own food or whatever it may be. So there's a huge number of other factors, but that's the things to me, the idea of the individual can actually exist in a city versus a tribe. It's not possible.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go with Rupali first because she has not spoken much. Rupali, go ahead.
So to piggyback on what Joe said, you know, the idea of how does an individual fit within a group and how does the group benefit from the individual? I think that's a good point, Joe. And the thing that I wanted to talk about cities is the architecture, right? Because that's the creation part of the human mind that you can, in the nomadic lifestyle, you don't see any permanent structures at all. You have no record of that. But once civilization starts, when cities are made, you start seeing the evidence of the human mind at work, and the structures that they left behind, the tools that they left behind. It gives you an insight of how they thought and how they lived.
No, that's fantastic point, because when you look at, you know, just what architecture is, right? I mean, this is the point that Bronowski makes in the next episode. You know, what you're seeing there is that it takes a lot of work to build buildings, to build roads, to actually structure things. So what you're trying to do is that you're trying to figure out how the human energy can flow better. And how do you structure this space to enable human energy to flow better, to kind of be able to do commerce, to gather, to do various things? You have kind of specialized buildings, specialized places where you do things. Then there is also ritual that develops. There is a calendar that comes. It's not just, every day is not the same. There are all these patterns. So it's like a entire design of space and time to make possible interaction and trade between human beings at a much, much higher level. That's a very different kind of human interaction than an interaction that happens in a hunter-gatherer family where everybody knows each other. So it's mostly human bodies interacting with one another in a natural, unmodified setting. Here you're saying, if 5,000 people need to interact with one another, how do we need to structure our environment to make it so? Architecture is kind of an integral part. It is the point that Bronowski makes of, you're now transforming nature, of saying, this is how it needs to be structured for human energy to flow well. Thank you. Next up is Phil, Dave, and Joe. Phil.
Yeah, as I said, the city is where the major move of transformation of civilization happens, because it acquires its own structure. First, you start out with the vision of land and ownership. Then you develop the need for buildings and city planning, how to structure the city as well. And once the structure begins to develop, then you understand, oh, we could structure society like the farmers are this class, the warriors in this class, the intellectuals in this class, so that you, in a sense, of course, they didn't have Marx back then, you could begin to exploit the workers in order to create this class of leisures and thinkers who could structure things and, in a sense, continue to dominate the situation. So it produces like structures that are productive and good, and other structures that are a perversion of what could be. So nonetheless, they are synthetic structures that is maybe a little reflective of nature, because the warrior class seems to me is more like a lion versus a lamb. So there's still that, but nonetheless, you have these layers of domination and then the distribution of goods in some sense. So even though the farmers produce everything, is like they only get a portion of it. So therefore, it develops synthetic structures that reflected the necessity of the expansion of civilization and the city. So there you are. Synthetic structures is the thing that is the most important.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent point. Absolutely.
And currency is also
absolutely. Let me just say, just a second. Hold on. Okay. This is a crucial point. I mean, the point about structure, because if you look at a life of a hunter-gatherer, quote unquote structure, which is there, it's basically soft structure. It is in the habits, in the culture, ways of doing things. And so there is no hard structure. There is this soft structure which is carried in the persons of people themselves. City is hard structures. You're developing synthetic structures, not just kind of physical structures, but structures of laws, structures of kind of morality, religion, which give a guidance, which kind of set principles, it sets kind of paths along which people move, and all of that is critical. So synthetic structures, I think, captures it beautifully. Thank you, Phil. Next up is Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. And extra credit for Joe for remembering the point that you're going to build a city on a river for a water supply, and a big river. And a lot of times you're going to build that city on the coast, but the river can be transportation. You have your farmer in the rural area can take his crop down to the river and let it float down to the city. And when you build a port, then you start building arcs or ships, and you're going to start having trade between different cities, different countries. Very important.
Excellent point. So this is fantastic, because it kind of, river gives you both those things. It not only gives you the farming base to support your city, but it gives you all the other cities are on the rivers too. So you're getting trade with other cities. Excellent point. Next up is going to be Joe.
Yeah, one of the It depends on how you look at it. Negative, possibly positive things that come from cities is the idea of over specialization. So it's not just, you know, there is specialization, their inability to have any type of specialization wasn't necessarily good for the nomads, right? Because everybody had to do everything. You had to figure it out, and there was no time to actually sit around and think. But the ability to do some degree of specialization to provide yourself with a little bit of time to learn about other things is critical. And then there is this over specialization in a city that can occur where you're only doing the one thing until that thing may not even be needed anymore. And so that's a problem in and of itself. So that's an interesting evolution that we could see where we went from, you know, the nomadic people, I forget their names already, they said there was no time for specialization, where there's a little time for specialization and people were able to develop new ideas and new thoughts. But then we go to the Henry Ford kind of assembly line where there's just that one thing that you do, and if you don't do anything else.
Joe, let's keep that for later on, because what happens is that there is just so much. I mean, you know, that's a great point. But I mean, well, one point is that the point is that you know, cities, that's where specialization starts, and it creates tremendous amount of value. But what you're saying is that after it develops a lot, and a lot of prosperity is created, then there is a problem that people still remain too specialized. That's what you're saying, right?
Yes.
So what we'll do is that he's going to take us through this entire story.
Oh, okay.
And what we'll do is that at that point, we'll look at it. You know, when we come to, I think it's called, I don't know what it's called. It's something about power. When it looks at industrial revolution, that's where we will visit this one, right? So that's where those issues.
Could I respond to that question? That's a very interesting question. I'll say something about it.
About what?
About specialization.
Okay,
but it's a direct response. It seems to me specialization was also a power structure that made it necessary for people to cooperate, because you're not able to do other things, so you actually need to be in a group. I don't think anybody planned that, but it became something that actually causes the weaving of society, because you actually are dependent on the other people to do it, because you don't know how to do it anymore. If you didn't know how to do it, you could just go on your own and do it yourself. Interesting. It's a structure of society.
No, that's excellent point. That's excellent point. The point is that, you know, it's the differentiation of labor requires integration. So that it has to all come together. Otherwise, the differentiation actually doesn't work at all, you know, because it's only people who are able to kind of put things together, finally, of saying, okay, okay, you're creating food, but you're creating so much more food that you can, and how is it going to be transported? Who's going to buy it? How are you going to find market for it? All of those questions. How are you going to account for it? How are you going to store it? All of those questions are being done by a whole bunch of people. So in order for the production of food to have a value, anything above kind of self-sustenance, all of those things need to be in place. So there is a lot of things that, so I think that's a great point, Phil. Next up is Laura. Laura, go ahead.
I'm sort of forgetting. Oh, I think also, you know, that the use of currency and banking has developed during this period as well, because you're dealing with international currencies. So that also is a transformation in the way the culture.
Excellent point, Laura. I mean, what happens is that, you know, initially, when you look at the, you know, look at writing, initial writing was just writing money, you know, or it was receipts for grain brought in. what was that? That was saying that, okay, you brought in this, I'm giving you this clay tablet. What it means is that you now have a right to get something from this storage later on. So that's kind of the start of, so, and money is crucial part of this whole thing. Go ahead, Laura. Laura, you need to unmute.
The store, you know, you have a store and you go and you say, I don't have the money. And they say, okay, pay me later. So you still have that kind of thing. But now it's just a little shit, you know, and that guy keeps track of it and eventually says, hey, you owe me this much money, you know, pay up. But that, so on a very, you know, micro level, that has begun. And then of course there's the bank, and of course people can put money in the bank and say, so a whole complex society.
Wonderful. I mean, it's kind of looking at it as a larger point. It's a question of storage. For a hunter-gatherer, they don't have capacity of storage. You know, they have to consume whatever they produce right away. Civilization is characterized by longer and longer ability to store things. You know, you're producing a lot more. You're able to store, transport, storage, and there are all these means of storage. Like money is a means of storage. It's also a means of conversion from one kind of a thing into another kind of a thing. So it's just fantastic. It's a huge idea. Next, let's go to the two questions about the transformation of the role of individual, and then we will come to women. So first is, you know, how does kind of view of human beings change from a hunter-gatherer level to agricultural level? Joe.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a fundamental change just from this hunter-gatherer, which you already know, to agriculture itself. So you're already going to have more information and more experience than you would have had otherwise, so that you've learned something new. But the idea of an individual is that, and he says this in the film, where he says, you're relegated to whatever your father did and whatever your father knew. That's no longer the case. You can start to work with the people that are actually putting together the plows, or working on irrigation, or, you know, and this is where leisure time, and you're not necessarily limited to just the direct experience, the concretes of the world. You can actually start to take time to even think abstractly, if you can write, if you have a written culture. But this is where it starts to allow for the person to carve out their own identity as to what they actually like to do and who they are as well. So it's the beginning of that process. And so it's a huge transition from when, and we saw this Wednesday where the gentleman showed, this is where my father's buried. He ran the tribe, and now I'm running the tribe, and my son will run the tribe. That's gone. You know, that is no longer. It is. I'm going to do what I think I can do. So
wonderful, excellent point, Joe. Thanks. Next up is Rupali.
So I think the role of the individual also is in terms of their capacity to think for themselves and set goals that, you know, I'd like to do this. Whereas in a nomadic lifestyle, trying to set goals beyond your daily survival was challenging. So now you can actually use the power of being human, the power to think, and actually make something happen with that power. And then whether you work individually or then work with a group of people, that interaction also happens between the individual and others.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, now they have universities and things that, you know, they can aspire to sending their children to.
Thank
you. Whole other level.
Thank you, Laura. Next up is going to be Linda, followed by Phil. Linda.
I think to get back to talking about cities, one of the fabulous things that happened with cities, we had the opportunity and actually the necessity to create a formal system of education and a mandatory system of education for the young. There wasn't as much of a need for it before. Once you developed a city, you had to have a population that was educated.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Phil.
Yeah, I actually disagree with that analysis. I actually think the city actually limited individuality because you are trapped into a skill that you're specialized in. So the city produces classes of people, professional classes of people, and you're limited to that thing. I actually think what happened is that people begin to resent a kind of resentment, like, hey, I could do this better than that guy. And so therefore, you begin to see the identity like, no, the specialization.
It's hot.
Put it over here, man.
Jeez.
I'm sorry. The specialization require an understanding of your specialty. So therefore, you begin to know that you are actually better than your boss. So that resentment produces a separation of you from that discipline, and then you begin to acknowledge your identity. And maybe later on, you begin to realize that, hey, I'm trapped in this class. I actually could be a warrior, right? I resent being stuck here.
Phil, are you saying that the people in the hunter-gatherer stage were more individualistic?
No, they were more individual in a different way. They were constrained by tradition, whereas this is now constrained by an external rule. And you say, okay, I could move up in the ladder in this discipline, and then you could say, I could actually move to the next class of people, which I'm not supposed to be in. And then that creates a kind of internal resentment that you sort of see the dissonance, and you separate yourself from that. And so therefore creates a kind of harmony, and actually creates criminals in one sense, right? Because I'm not going to follow the rules because these are synthetic, like I'm better than the rules.
Okay, let me have a couple of people. So it's going to be Laura followed by Linda. Laura.
To some extent, I can agree with you, but I really think you're taking it a little bit too far afield. I think that, that idea that somebody's going to grow to such a stage where all that's going to happen. I think on a lower level, like my father, shoot horses, and he says that I'm allowed to think about something else, and I can go, my father will support me to go to school or something to become something else. I think it's more likely to happen, and that they're not going to be so locked in at that stage in life. I don't know, but you have your feeling and I have mine. I don't think what you're talking about is going to happen so readily in that society.
Thank you, Laura. Next up is Linda.
My question to Phil is, why does he think that in these new cities, why do you feel that people will not try to reach that higher level? Do you think that they are so trapped at one level that they cannot even try to attain a higher level?
No, let's keep the discussion general. Let's keep at the topic of individuals. So I have several comments. I strongly disagree with Phil because I think he's mixing up different levels. So so let's start with the hunter-gatherer level. I think the individuality there is almost non-existent because you're completely dependent on your tribe. Like everything around you, you're kind of barely surviving, and you are at danger of being ostracized. If you get thrown out of the tribe, you die. I mean, that's your situation. Individual is at a complete mercy of the group. So there is no individuality in that context. Now, what happens is that when we go to the next level, I think it is very important not to use our current standards of individuality to judge individuality at that level. Okay, we are talking about the versioning of individuality. So to judge it by our standards of how I can be individual now, I don't think it's fair, because it misses a lot of points. So when you move from being completely beholden to your group, to participating in a city, it gives you a level of freedom which is greater, because you have ability of associating with more people. You have more choices, dramatically more choices. Yes, there are constraints, but those constraints are, I mean, you had even more constraints when you had where you couldn't do anything other than go with this group back and forth all your life, with the sheep. Here you have some amount. It's still, the life is very hard. Okay, life in these early cities is very hard. And we again can't judge their life by the prosperity that we have and the options that we have. So there is that. There is a progression of the development of individuality there. And the person who has done the most magnificent job on that is Julian Jaynes. Because initially what happens is that you are just trying to follow the rules. And instead of following the rules of people around you, you start following the rules of your society. You start hearing voices of kings and voices of your ancestors, and you do whatever is to be done with just a little amount of freedom. It's when those things fall apart and you start kind of moving to the stage of saying that you have a mental space, you can yourself project different ways of doing things and evaluate them and choose between them, you move to a different level. That takes things like writing, where you are able to put your thoughts down and reflect on it. So there is a level of kind of self-consciousness, that is growth of self-consciousness, which goes along with the growth of individuality. So there is a progression. And the only thing I'm saying, the most important thing I'm saying is that we can't judge first cities by our standards, because that's actually missing a lot of the thing that we are counting on. The civilization has developed through a lot of struggle, and people before us had very serious constraints to deal with. These are life and death constraints that they dealt with. So we can't look at their context from our perspective. Judith.
Yeah, I agree with what you were saying, Shrikant. I would just add that, well, what I was mentioning in the group is, my breakout group, is that I feel like it has something to do with the fact that in a nomadic tribe, you don't have anything else to look at except your immediate, quote unquote, family. It's like one family. And as soon as you move into a village where there are separate nuclear families, then you can look to see people are doing things differently. And as soon as you see differences in ways that people do things, you start to question. But it seems like in a nomadic tribe, that idea of feeling suppressed in any way, like, oh, my individuality, I have no individuality, wouldn't even exist, because there isn't anything else to look at to have that feeling.
Excellent point. Laura.
Let's not forget that children are now being educated. And so I think the role of education comes into this, where children will get ideas among themselves in their own mind and may begin to propagate, ideas about wanting to do things beyond what their fathers have done.
Sure, thank you. I just want to say that we are talking about a time here, in Sumeria, whether Egypt or Anatolia, we're talking about only a very small percentage, like 1% of children, 1% of people are reading and writing. So yes, this is happening, but this is happening in a very, very tiny minority of people. The other people are benefiting from what is going on, because these are the people who are able to do kind of accounting and planning, all of that. But you have to keep that. This is not universal education. This is about 1%. This is making possible. Again, over time it will spread. Over time it will grow. But that's the structure right now. Marjorie.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that I think Borowski pointed out that the pace of development, once there were villages and cities, occurred exponentially, and that so that innovation, there was much more opportunity for innovation because it was occurring so much faster. So people had the opportunity, in at least in theory, that they could contribute to new developments, whereas in hunter-gatherer societies, the roles were very constrained. So there was little innovation happening. And there was no opportunity really to say, well, this is something new. They're building a bridge to get our, sheep over there across the mountain faster. So I can figure out a way to do that, help with that building of the bridge, because that just wasn't part of the, society.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marjorie. I want to make one more comment. I mean, when you look at these early cities, right, life there is very structured. It is very structured. And that is a huge advancement in what was there before. And then slowly things happen, few people, start reading and writing, few people start trading. That keeps transforming things. So it's like, the transformation is slow, gradual, over centuries. So the individuality grows over time in a dramatic, it's a significant growth, but it happens in stages. Phil.
Yeah, I just realized that in a sense why the Levant and Anatolia developed later, because in the beginning the rivers were very important because transportation was within inland. So this the rivers were mostly an inland transport. Same thing with Egypt. But as it grows, the coastline became more important because there was contact with international trade, and so it developed later. But the sea became actually more important than the rivers in a sense. So it became the next stage. And then of course, like Anatolia, the coast, and then even Greece, so that internationalism, so cosmopolitanism in a funny way didn't really happen until a later stage when they actually began to sail to other civilizations and had communications there. Whereas before it was still kind of like within the Sumerians, one city next to each other. So in that sense, it started with the rivers, but it moved to the coastlines that was close to each other. If you want China, unfortunately, things were a little bit further away. In India, you have to sail across the Indian Ocean. So yeah, so in that sense, it was very interesting. So that whole Middle East became a breathing ground because international trade could actually develop.
Yeah, no, that's excellent point. I mean, you can see the same pattern hold in Greece. Greece had these independent cities, but they were all, many of them were seafaring. They were good coast, and so there is this tremendous exchange of ideas across civilizations, across cities, which is a crucial part of the growth. All right. So we'll take the last question, which is about role of women. What do you think about the transformation of role of women from the hunter-gatherer, nomadic culture to civilization? Again, please remember that we have a long way to go. We are just looking at the beginning, but whatever your thoughts are. Joe.
Yes, we definitely have a long way to go. So I'll just preface it with that. But going back to where we were, the idea that women were seen as somehow as a liability with the tribe, with the nomadic tribe, because I guess I forget the exact reason why Bronowski actually mentioned.
They weren't strong enough.
They weren't strong enough. They weren't strong enough to get across the river. I thought that was okay. And so, you know, that challenge, that goes away. So then you can start to, you know, it's not only become an individual, but you can start to think differently as well. I mean, I understand that this is still a different time and this is the beginning of civilization, but women weren't necessarily relegated to one or two duties. Possibly in a village, they could probably have a little bit more of one, they could have more free time, but number two is that they could also do other things as opposed to just living hand to mouth or doing what they needed to do for survival. So I mean, at that particular moment in time, it just gave them a little bit more freedom than they otherwise had, which was, it was pretty limited.
I mean, one thing, I mean, I don't know much about this, but again, in anthropology, it looks like this has varied quite a bit. Role of women in hunter-gatherer types has varied based on the kind of tribe it is. So for example, this tribe has to travel a lot. It's hard work to actually move back and forth, go across the rivers, stuff like that. That's one kind of context. The context where you're, you know, like an Amazon forest where everything, you know, there is a lot of food lying around. That's very different. The role of women is different in those tribes. So even what I'm saying is that even at that level, there is a variation between places. It's going to be Rupali, Dave, and Phil. Rupali.
So I agree with you, Shrikant, that the roles are going to be varied across different tribes or different civilizations. If you look at Mohenjo-daro, you have this figure of this very proud lady standing with, you know, in a very dominating pose. So clearly in that civilization, women had a larger role. But I think for most part, the roles were divided between men and women, so that the women were basically tending to the children and nurturing, cooking, making clothes, and the men were doing the manual labor, so as to say. So I feel there was still a division of labor among men and women. And that division actually kept the families growing, because not one person had to just do all of the work. It was a mutual agreement that, okay, I'm going to nurture the children while the man provides for the family.
Wonderful. I just want to make a general point here. We're studying Ascent of Man. We're studying kind of the entire progression. And so I think we have to be extremely cognizant when we are looking at something far back, that we don't use our standards, our values, our everything in order to figure out and in order to evaluate what that is. Because you kind of have to, in order to really understand these things, you have to place yourself in that position as much as you possibly can, and to see what the issues are, because the constraints are going to be different. And if we don't do that, then we don't get anything from studying history, because then we are just simply evaluating what we are, some concretes from the past from our current perspective. So I think it is well worth it to kind of take the time to do that. Now, also, I want to say that there is a lot, especially in this first episode, second episode, third episode, there is a lot of work that has happened since Bronowski, which has been amazing, he's basically on the right track, but there is a lot more richness to the story, all of which has been worked out by many people. This has been a golden age of both biology and of anthropology. So there is a lot out there to learn about it. But the only way to do that is to look at these people in their own terms and understand what is going on. Next up is going to be it's going to be Amanda and Sam, then Dave, then Phil. Amanda.
Hi, Shrikant. Thank you. Yeah, so I just to piggyback off of the last comment, when talking about like different roles that were served, like I like to think of it in ways of practicality. I think that early humans were extremely intelligent in their choices for roles because it wasn't based on mental prowess or, like talk about the ascent of man, like it was primal and it was based on kind of instinctive needs. And I think they were kind of right on point as far as the physicality is concerned. Of course, that means different things now that, mentally we've evolved to the point where our mind kind of can supersede in a certain way, our physicality. But yeah, so I wanted to add that about gender roles.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, to kind of expand on that further, I mean, consider, for example, we sit, they walked. Walking is much more natural to our body, and that changes everything. That actually changes how our emotions work, how our mind works. We have diseases of civilization, of having abundance. So given our taste buds, we end up eating too much and putting on too much weight. So there is all kinds of it. So in that sense, they are closer to the biological nature because they are in a context which is our evolutionary context. So and not only that, but also in terms of dealing with each other at a human level, there is something that is natural about human family. And in some ways, when we advance in civilization, we lose some of that because we focus on other things. So there are those aspects that are there that you can pick up. Next up is going to be Dave, Judith, and Phil. Dave.
Thanks, Shrikant, and thanks for Joe for being the first man to talk about the women's issues. But going back to Australia, the Aborigines, the indigenous people of Australia, I know we talked about them being patriarchal and question about where there might be a women's society. Remind me of my reading of the indigenous people in North America, that of course patriarchal, but the women would take care of the children. And when they would observe a young girl having her first menstrual cycle, they would put her in a tent by herself and obviously bring her food and water, but I believe for a month. So she would go in the tent, a girl, and come out a woman. So that would be one of the functions that women would serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Judith, followed by Phil. Judith.
Yeah, so when it comes to the role of women, I think it's just like any other role, just like we were talking about, it was the environment that the nomads lived in that dictated how, what kind of life they would have and what their roles were. And that really has never, ever changed. That's true everywhere you go. So one thing that is given is that women are the ones that have the reproductive role, whatever you want to call it. They have to carry the child for 9 months, that's a physical reality. So really the difference would come is how different cultures or societies would value that role. But they're always going to have that factored in as a given. It's just never going to be, exactly the same. That's a difference.
Wonderful. Folks, we are running a little late, so I'm going to wrap up. I just want to tell you that I think today's was fantastic. I think it was just great. And I think it's a great work. I love it immensely. And I am just delighted. I think today was good. And so I'm going to continue this next week. The third episode is one of my favorites. You know, it really, I mean, if this episode talks about the distinction between nomad and agriculture at the existential level, what the next episode does is that it talks about it at an epistemological level, begins to talk about it at epistemological level. The difference between molding things and cutting things, knowing where to cut and how to cut things, which is analytical as opposed to kind of integrative. So adding that to your toolkit is what the civilization is about. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to keep it heavily interactive, just like this. So look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Hey, thank you, Shrikant.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
So,
I'm glad you keep
Thank
going.
you.
so Joe, I think this is going very well.
It is going well.
I was very pleased.
I'm happy. That was very, very good.
Yeah, this is great.
There was a lot of interaction.
Yeah, Joya, did you watch all of this or did you fall asleep?
No, I'm still here. It was great. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful.
Yep. See you tomorrow.
Next time, hopefully you will talk more.
Yes.
We were just hanging out to see what the after talk was like. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. So
Yeah, no. This is good. So, so Sam and Amanda, where are you folks?
we're in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, where are you all?
Philadelphia.
I'm in New York,
Oh, no kidding.
and Mike is in Magic Land.
Mike is where are you, Shrikant?
I'm in New York,
Oh, you're in New York.
which is the real
New
Magic.
York.
I don't have
Are you talking about the New York City?
the
Yeah.
New York City. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm at Penn Station, which is like the heart of everything.
Because I'm from New York State, so
Ah.
and those are two very different things. New York City is like the New York City.
Yeah, people like to steal our name, the state. There are all these
The
boroughs.
state likes to steal your
They also call themselves New York. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I get that. And what about you, Dave? Dave,
That's why we
I
have to
think
name it twice, just to make sure. New York, New York.
so. I think Dave, I've met you before at a young talk with Aiden. I've seen you there before.
Oh, okay, probably.
Yeah. So hello. I don't think we've ever spoken, but
Yeah, Tacoma, Washington. I think Mike is in Florida. And Shrikant, there's even a York, England that's stealing your name. So you better watch out. They're all over the place.
No kidding. No kidding.
As Dao De Jing says, naming doesn't make it so.
That's true.
You know,
Well
I would
put.
like to come to those discussions, but I'd be honest with you, I like to be in bed. Like I like to at least try and be in bed by like 10. So, I mean, you guys are late night owls, so that's good.
Yeah. I mean, I do it at 9 o'clock because it becomes possible for the West Coast to join. We got a
Oh, no,
lot
I
of,
think it's great. I do. I think it's great. I mean,
and
someday I'll stay up until then, not on a Friday.
I mean, we do lots of meetups on the weekend.
Yes.
Those are-
52 living ideas, right?
Yeah, 52 Living Ideas. You have to go to. You have to join. Have you joined 52 Living Ideas? You should join.
I
Because-
have.
Okay.
I have. And
Um,
I do sign up for a lot of the meetups, but then like most of them during the week at 9, I always end up opting out of because So
Yeah, no,
I'm
it's,
like an 80-year-old woman.
Sam, what about you? What do you do?
I'm sorry.
What do you do?
I'm an engineer or a software engineer.
Okay.
I just graduated from college a few months ago, actually.
Okay.
Congratulations.
He's an evolved kid, man. He was talking about like the ego and all these things when he was like 15.
Oh,
He's-
So what-
he's-
What's the range of your interest, Sam? What do you read?
What do I read? I'm trying to read more technical things as of late, but I was always a fan of like dystopian novels or American history probably actually would be the most literature that I've read is 100% American history.
Wow.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine, Brad, talk about, he's written an entire book on the American mind, how American mind different from, how did it form differently? And I have
spoiled.
What's that? No,
it's spoiled. It's a entitled American mind is what it is.
It wasn't so. There wasn't anything to be entitled about.
Really? Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a personal view.
Yeah. No, I mean, back then, like, when America was founded, it was very.
Oh, right. Okay. No, they were righteously indignant then.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. All right. Great talking to you folks.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Nice to talk to you too. Thanks,
Amanda, I actually sent you an article on shame since you brought it up.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
In the chat.
I am going to click on that now. Thank you, Joseph.
No problem. It was a value of shame, the importance of it. Yeah.
There actually, there is a, yeah. All right. Thank you. I'll see you.
All right. Take care. Good night, everyone.
Bye.